fashion and the representation of Brazilian dress in National Geographic, which was published in 2018, and is currently working on a new monograph titled Fashion and the Devil's Railroad, Dress, Temporality and Modernities in the Brazilian Amazon. So obviously today's paper is part of that ongoing research. Fashion on the Devil's Railroad, the materialities of working, wearing and caring for clothes in the Brazilian Amazon.
Thanks, and for organising the conference. I do have to apologise because I know that there are two people in the room who have seen iterations of this before with minor amendments, but I want to start my paper today by reiterating that the world is made of stories, not facts. And I suppose that's what fascinates me about fashion history, because fashion history is a form of storytelling which ties together geography, telling stories about the land, nationality, telling stories about the nation, and identity, telling stories about the self. The story of my paper today begins with 13 glass plate negatives held by the Museo Paulista in Sao Paulo, which were produced in 1911 by the New York photographer Dana Bertrand Merrill. They depict anonymous, unskilled migrant male labourers who worked on the Madeira-Mamoré Railroad and who would have been responsible for culling the jungle, laying the tracks, building bridges and maintaining the rights of way. The Madeira-Mamoré Railroad was built in the Brazilian Amazon between 1907 and 1912 by American entrepreneurs in alliance with Bolivia and Brazil. It was intended to expedite the global exploitation of rubber from landlocked Bolivia by providing an outlet through the upper Amazon basin to the Atlantic Ocean and onto the markets of Europe. You can see this on the map, but just to say that the location of the railway is still 500 miles away from Manaus, which is perhaps the best known city within the Amazon. So we're talking very far western Brazil in the state of Acre that was formerly Bolivia. Such multinational contracts were not uncommon in the early decades of the 20th century, a period of increased Pan-Americanism as North America actively sought to expand its commercial, social, political, economic and military ties with South America. Yet the railroad became memorialized in the Brazilian media as the Devil's Railroad due to the shocking death toll of its exceptionally diverse workforce. By the time the railroad was inaugurated on the 1st of August 1912, it was already the beginning of the end, because the rubber seed had been transported to the Far East, rendering the project already obsolete and an immediate economic failure. The story of the Madeira-Mamoré Railroad, however, is one that brought together a polyglot workforce from over 52 nations. Migrant labourers from Britain, the United States, Germany, China, Greece, India, the Caribbean, Portugal, Spain and Japan, as well as from northeastern Brazil, coalesced in this remote and inhospitable location, and hence reveal in microcosm the spatial networks of industrial modernity that witnessed over 3 million immigrants arrive in Brazil between 1884 and 1920. The cultural geographer Doreen Massey provides an interesting lens through which to reflect upon this micro-society by urging us to reimagine space relationally, which is far from an empty stage or a flat surface, but rather, quote, a pincushion of a million stories, unquote. Her allusion to the dressmaker's quintessential tool resonates with her reconceptualization of space as process. It is, quote, a simultaneity of stories so far, in which places are collections of those stories, articulations within the wider power geometries of space, unquote. Massey encourages us to stop thinking of space only in terms of conquest, exploration, voyages of discovery and the pushing out across land from the perspective of Western Europeans and North Americans. Rather, we ought to consider cross-cultural encounters as a meeting up with others who are also journeying, also making histories. So whilst the abandoned remains of rusting locomotives and disused machinery that you can see in the photograph on the right still haunt the contemporary Amazonian landscape today, and of course they point to the contradictions and the ambiguities of this extractive and exploitative modernizing process, which was orientated, of course, to North American capitalist concerns. Despite this, I would argue that Dana Bertrand-Merrill's quiet portraits of anonymous migrant construction workers strike a delicate balance between the specific and the universal, the local and the global. In light of Frederick Winslow Taylor's inhumane reduction of the body in his 1911 text, The Principles of Scientific Management, wherein human becomes machine, quantifiable entirely in terms of actions and how much time they take to accomplish, here we have instead an unequivocally humanizing gaze. My research examines the relationship between fashion, photography, and the different temporal regimes of colonial modernity in order to trace how our understanding of global systems is shaped by the desire to exploit people, time, and space. It focuses on the different individuals involved in the construction of the Madeira Memorial Railroad, using them as a case study to examine the relationship between fashion and time itself. Whether for the US and Brazilian administrators that you can see here, the Brazilian rubber tappers, local indigenous groups, Caribbean laundry staff, or the anonymous workers from all over the world that I began this paper with. I'm interested in the role that photographic representation plays in supporting a particular world order by equating fashion with timekeeping through the documentation of different individuals and their engagement with diverse clothing systems. We don't know very much about the author of these photographs, Dana Bertrand-Merrill, except that he was a relatively unknown commercial photographer working in New York in the early 20th century. Between 1909 and 1911, he briefly swapped city for nature before returning to the US to produce the fairly uninspiring images for Condé Nast that you can see here. Although it was common practice since the late 19th century for the emerging medium of photography, with its purportedly scientific perspective, to be used in the realization and imagination of great civil engineering projects, Merrill's portraits are distinct in that they deviate from usual conventions in their documentation of an anonymous workforce. Rather than social documentary, the photographer followed a carefully prescribed formula, more akin to the genre of portraiture. The subjects presented outside, centrally framed, with minimal contextual detail and photographed either individually, in pairs, or in small groups. As studies in portraiture, these photographs stand out for their meticulous composition and the quiet yet compelling stillness that pervades them. The click of the shutter here marks a literal pause in the working day, allowing time for the diverse subjects to pose, as the photographer's gaze is trained on those bodies whose manual labour was so crucial to the successful completion of the railroad. These photographs sharpen our focus on the estimated 10,000 of these migrant workers who died during the construction, due to malaria, dysentery, yellow fever, wild animal attacks, and fights with one another and the indigenous peoples that they encountered. The portraits thus speak volumes in their silence, presenting us with the intense physical presence of unknown individuals who have remained largely anonymous in historical accounts, but can be seen here to grapple with their own desire to pose or to avoid a pose, which is arguably another form of pose, as they unwittingly insert themselves into history through gesture, expression, gaze, and dress. What emerges from the series is how certain subjects adjust their bodies accordingly, while others stand awkward and restless, dependent ultimately upon how comfortable an individual is with positioning his body before the camera during the length of time that passes as the photograph is being taken. I would just say that this photograph in particular reminded me of the point that Ilya was making yesterday, perhaps, of the way that people feel within their bodies and how this ends up becoming an essential component of their representation, particularly with the man on the left who looks fed up. Like sad enough. Most obviously, each portrait signals how crucial dress and appearance were to articulate the sense of identity and belonging within the remote geographical location so far from a home. They serve as a reminder that fashionability for their protagonists is not just about clothing, but equally how one stages the self through a range of bodily styles. A comparison with the colour autochromes of Albert Kahn in his expansive project Les Archives de Planète from 1908 to 1931, which in many ways, of course, essentialises difference, nevertheless enables us to speculate on the cultural origins of certain items of dress, such as the distinctive waistcoat worn in Merrill's photograph on the left, which may have originated in the Balkans or Greece. Yet there are, of course, distinct problems in using such sartorial clues to categorise dress based on surface appearance, since we know from diary entries and memoirs that a local economy of clothing circulated on the railroad. One worker describes in his memoir how, quote, as soon as a man died out in camp or in the hospital, his clothing, money, and everything else of value was made into a bundle and sent to me by the doctor in charge, with a memo and a list of articles for disposition. We usually sold any wearing apparel in good condition to other employees, and then we made up a sealed package containing money, jewellery, and other articles of value to send to his family. We first destroyed any photographs of Brazilian sweethearts that worker had met in Para or Manaus. Less obviously, the subject's clothing is illustrative of the profound material relationship that their anonymous wearers had with their immediate environment, as identity connects to surface in varying degrees of sartorial dilapidation. A scuffed boot, a sweat-stained shirt, a patched-up pair of trousers, or a repaired sun hat. Given the lack of tangible sources of workwear and everyday dress in Brazilian and US collections, these glass plate negatives provide an important analytical tool for the fashion historian, who must continually locate new ways to explore fashion beyond the obvious. Photographs, as the visual anthropologist Sarah Pink articulates, quotes, have the capacity to bring textures, memories, and the sensory surfaces that they evoke right up close to the reader, unquote. In the absence of historical accounts of the individuals featured within these photographs, poetry, diary extracts, and memoirs preserved in archives in the US and Brazil help to breathe life into the visual, and to understand how clothing was used, worn, washed, and exchanged within this remote frontier society. By disrupting the dominant timekeeping that was imposed on these subjects by the North American contractors who regulated and disciplined their body of labour, I argue that these glass plate negatives complicate the forward-moving linear time epitomised by the railroad and its promise of modern industrial progress. This is something that Wolfgang Schivelbusch writes about in his text. It's quite famous, it's called The Railway Journey. It talks about the annihilation of time and space that the the railway brought about. My argument is that these photographs actually complicate that idea because they show us that this linear idea of progress was also undercut by these periods of slowness and delay and prolonged waiting. So I'm interested in the modes of agency enacted by the subjects and whether the stories of their clothing, whether known or pieced together, ever reveals in fact a temporal sleight of hand to the dominant logic of the camera's gaze. The pace and narrative of individual garments represented are understood according to Margaret Maynard's assertion in her recent book, Dressed in Time, where she talks about how we need to look for new modes of temporality in fashion, because time and dress merge in the acts of making, remaking, trading, handing down, etc. These photographs is a pull upon the viewer, encouraging deliberation over acceleration. To watch a photograph is, according to Ariella Azoulay, to wonder what it is that addresses the viewer so powerfully with the tangible presence of an individual. Here, surely it is the directness of the subject's gaze, his awareness of the camera that is plainly demonstrated as eyes meet lens, and the overriding sense that a moment in time has been temporarily stilled. Our gaze rests upon the isolated body, enveloped in worn items of utilitarian dress. We also see the subject's straw hat that has been crudely patched up in two separate places, a visual clue that hints at the necessity for the subject to repair and rewear his wardrobe. The photographer's monochrome palette also renders in clarity the machine stitching that traces the form of his mass-produced shirt, but also illuminates the very individual creases and folds of the coarse fabric as it stretches and adapts to the shapes and movements of his body. Such an evocative dramatization of fabric and figure acts as a conduit for the researcher to probe at the identity of the anonymous subject in lieu of biographical information. His worn clothing is a literal embodiment of time having passed, which resonates with the photographer's considered approach to documentation that seems to demand from the viewer an equally slow and measured mode of viewing. The materiality of old workwear takes on a performative function as a means of visual resistance to the regimented time regime of North American modernity and its valorization of speed, progress, and the new. It is in this respect that we can draw points of comparison with portraits of immigrant workers repairing their clothing, whether trousers on the left or boots on the right, that were documented by the Italian photographer Vincenzo Pastore in Sao Paulo around the same time. Merrill's portraits present then an irony. Although slowing down modernity through the limitations of the camera technology, the bodies on display with their worn and weathered fashions that have adapted and changed in response to the hot and humid environments and the demanding nature of the job, in fact bear witness to the irreversible direction of time as it marches on. And we can draw comparisons with other representations such as August Sanders, the way in which he organised people into types, and also Augustus Sherman, who documented immigrants arriving at Ellis Island in New York around the same time, as well as Mark Ferrez, a Brazilian photographer who was documenting the huge changes taking place in Rio de Janeiro in the late 19th century. To conclude, however, I suppose that we need to consider the different experiences of time from the perspective of the viewer who can linger over these productive images, taking as much time as she likes, the photographer who was reimbursed for his time and could wander freely, experimenting with different camera angles and the long exposure times of his camera, and finally the subjects who were not remunerated for their time but were in fact losing time, since these photographs are likely to have been taken on their break or at the end of a shift. Although Merrill's portraits encourage the viewer to linger, there is a privilege in that lingering and an inequality in the very act of how we interpret these images 100 years on. Were the photograph subjects to linger too whilst at work, it is likely that they would have been accused of malingering. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do you have questions, comments?
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was really very, very interesting, and it reminded me of an exhibition that I saw a few years ago at the Police Museum in Sydney of images of what were to become mugshots, but they were full-length photographs. And what was so exciting about that exhibition, and I saw in your paper, was that the person taking the photographs was actually not really taking a photograph in the sense that they were perhaps supposed to be taking a photograph. They were exploring photography as a different kind of medium. And I wondered if that was something that you had looked at in your work.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think historically, photography has been talked about a lot using Susan Sontag, this idea of the gaze, that you shoot, that is very violent language. And I find that a bit reductive because I think photographs are very complicated. I think they bear witness to this interaction that took place in the past between two people, or maybe more. And an interaction always involves collaboration. So in a way it takes me back to the point that Doreen Massey is making, that yes, colonialism is pushing out, but to understand it only in that sense is to ignore the fact that there's also a kind of pushing back. And I suppose that's kind of my interest, the way in which power, it operates in both ways. People can be subject to it, but they can also resist it, and it can be empowering to do that through the body. The problem is how do you piece together an understanding of that collaborative interaction between photographer and subject. I do it primarily through dress, but it can't just be based upon my speculation. So that's kind of hunting to find written accounts that people left behind to try and understand it. But absolutely, that I have to look this up. Sounds very, very kind of in parallel.
It was a really, it was a really great exhibition, and particularly because when you're talking about how people felt comfortable in front of the camera, the people who were being arrested and photographed were actually incredibly comfortable in front of the camera and posed often. And it was a very clear demonstration of an acceptance of modernity and dress and kind of, comfort in one's own skin.
Yeah.
Also an understanding of how one stood in front of a camera. Also how obviously the photographer had encouraged that as well. And I think that relationship is so interesting and something that, as you say, when we talk about photography, we rarely focus on. And it's something obviously that does come out of archive work. So thank you so much for sharing the photo.
They're online. A lot of them are online as well, at the police museum.
Okay. I'll have a look. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really love how you make these images speak and these subjects speak, and how you unpack this interaction you just spoken about. Do I get it right that we don't know anything about why these photos were taken and?
So Dana Bertram Merrill was employed by the Brazilian government to document the construction of the railway, which is interesting because it's a kind of reminder of how, we can spend a long time talking about kind of what modernity is and how people might exist beyond modernity, but the railway is this sort of intersection of American ideas of modernity, incredibly exploitative, but also Brazilian ideas too that are equally exploitative. So he's employed by the Brazilian government, presumably to sort of, I suppose, document the progress. And this is where I'm confused, because when you look at these images of these men, maybe I should just say quickly that in the 80s, the Brazilian military dictatorship burned most of the archives of the railway, which is why it's pieced so sporadically, which I would say is the kind of hardest part of my project, researching the everyday and then researching the everyday that has largely been disposed of. But I still can't work out whether these photographs of these men, they look very clean to me, like freshly laundered, shirts at times, like their facial hair is shaved, they look quite manicured. So maybe this humanistic portrayal is actually a form of propaganda. It's hard to say. I'm trying to contrast the images against the very, very strict regime of timekeeping that was implemented on the railway, because that kind of sits in relation to this kind of late, since this standardization or uniformity of time keeping that's happening, that we kind of adhere to now when we talk about time zones. And yeah, did that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. I don't think I phrased it as a question, but you told me wonderful things. Thank you. I'm still tempted to ask about your use of the word title of your paper, because I think just now you've been talking about dress more. So could you specify if you can see a helpful terminological distinction between the two?
Yeah, well, Angela Jansen talks about distinctions between fashion as a noun, as a system, and fashion as a verb. And I would say that a lot of what I very much see fashion as a verb that any body is subject to change. And maybe a lot of the problem is the kind of methods that we use that make it difficult to track that change. So I suppose in a way, this project looks at the different sectors of this micro-society, and I've presented the labourers in this particular talk. But I would say that even their workwear is subject to fashion and to change, and you can kind of see that through the way in which it's worn and it's weathered and how their bodies have adapted to it. So I think my definition of fashion is I'm trying to push for this more expansive definition where we can locate change taking place. But it's a work in progress.
Hi Elizabeth, thank you for your very interesting talk. It reminded me very much of some photos of workers. I have lived in Italy and I have a little house in the mountains, and there they've got a documentation of a lot of workers from the same period, either miners or ones working in the dikes that they were building up there for the electricity. It's about the same period, and I think that there was a fashion, if you like, to take photographs to document this rise of modernity and these new ways forward. So I don't think in that sense it was political. I think perhaps it was a local photographer who was just taking photos, and they look very proud of what they're doing. What was interesting is that it's a very tight community, and they're wearing pretty much the same sort of dress. Whereas with your photos, what's so fascinating is that people came from so many different countries that the dress sense was mixed in a way, very much, and I found this really interesting. So it isn't a question, it was just a comment.
Yeah, you have to tell me the details, because I'd really like to know. Maybe.
But I think it's fascinating that you can see it in different places in the world as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think even though photography is a tool of Western European modernity, it's also interesting to see how it's being not taken up, but being used in Brazil in a way that's kind of in conversation with that, but also sometimes in more distinctive ways. So yeah, it'd be really interesting.
Yeah, and what's really interesting now is that in around the towns, they've printed these photos and they've got them so that you can see them when you walk around, like an open air exhibition of things, and also of women. there's a town that has these what the women did and who they were and specific. So it's quite interesting. I'll say that.
Thank you, thanks.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was actually the end of the first part of this day, and we're going to have a very short coffee break. Try to keep it as short as possible. Everyone,